I've worked in a crematorium long enough to forget the faces of most of the dead. After 18 years, the smell of formaldehyde, the hum of the furnace, the cold metal trays, all of it becomes background noise. You stop believing anything can shake you. You stop believing the dead have anything left to say. But that night proved me wrong. It was a little past 3 a.m., the hour when even the machines seem tired and the silence feels heavy enough to break. I remember standing alone in the prep room, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, when the body bag on my table moved. Not much. Just an inch. Just enough. I told myself it was nothing. Nerves. There. Reflex. But then came the sound, the soft, deliberate tap tap tap, from inside the furnace that wasn't even on. And that was the moment I realized, the dead don't always stay quiet and some nights they knock back. I didn't choose this job because I had a strong stomach or because death didn't scare me. Truth is, I grew up terrified of losing people. My mother died when I was 16 and I never got to say goodbye, just a closed casket and a priest who barely knew her name. Maybe that's why I ended up here. Maybe that's why I've spent 18 years tending to the dead with a kind of reverence I never got to give her. I always believed that if I handled the endings of strangers carefully enough, mine would hurt a little less. So I built a routine, a rhythm, a way to make peace with the silence. But that night reminded me the silence can lie. The night started like every other night shift, the kind of silence that makes the whole building feel like it's holding its breath. People think crematoriums are chaotic or full of whispers, or haunted by sobbing mourners. But the truth is quieter. Much quieter. Death has a way of emptying a room even when the lights are on. It was 2:47 a.m. when I walked into the prep hall, coffee in hand, the kind that tastes like burned dirt but keeps me from falling asleep. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing the way old lights do when they're not sure if they want to stay alive. The air felt colder than usual, crisp enough to sting the skin on my arms. Nights like this always felt heavier, like the walls remembered things the living had forgotten. I clocked in, the machine giving a tired beep that echoed through the empty hallway. The building always felt different after midnight. The air didn't just feel cold, it felt aware. As if the quiet itself belonged to someone, or something else. The furnace room was down the corridor, past the storage closets, past the metal shelving lined with urns awaiting pickup. Carl used to warn me about this hallway. Not in a dramatic way, Carl wasn't dramatic about anything. But sometimes, when we worked the late shift together, he'd glance toward the furnace room like he was expecting someone to walk out of it. Machines remember things, he once told me, tightening a bolt on the control panel. Especially the ones that seem more dead than living. If the temperature ever spikes before you start a cycle, you walk away. Don't ask questions. Don't play hero. He always said it half joking, but his eyes never matched the joke. Back then I thought he was just tired. Now I know better. Every urn has a name, but after you work here long enough you stop reading them. It's easier that way. Easier not to imagine the lives behind each polished surface. I pushed open the heavy fire-rated door to the prep room. The hinges groaned in protest. The smell hit instantly, a mix of disinfectant, cold steel, and the faint lingering scent of smoke from earlier in the evening. Every crematorium has its own scent, and ours had settled deep into my clothes, my hair, even my sleep. The body for the 3 a.m. burn was already waiting for me. A white sheet draped over the metal table, the corners tucked in neatly by the coroner who dropped him off. The tag tied around the ankle read, Hartman Leonard. Age, 40 to 42. Time of death, 11:58 p.m. Cause, vehicle collision. The handwriting looked rushed, uneven, like someone filling out a form while their hands were shaking. I didn't think much of it at the time. Coroners get exhausted too, especially on Friday nights. But the room felt strange the moment I stepped closer. Colder, though the thermostats read a stable 50 degrees. The silence grew sharper, as if every sound was being swallowed before it could reach my ears. And underneath it all, there was an odd pressure, like walking into a church where a service had just ended, and the air still carried the weight of prayers. I pulled on my gloves, letting the snap of the latex break the quiet. Normally that sound made me feel grounded. Not tonight. Tonight it felt like the walls flinched when it echoed. I reached for the zipper of the body bag, expecting the usual stiffness of a corpse cooled for several hours. But the instant my fingers brushed the plastic, a faint creak sounded from somewhere behind me. I froze. It wasn't loud, just the softest shift of metal, like someone brushing past the instrument cart. I turned around. Nothing moved. Nothing out of place. The cart stood exactly where I left it, wheels locked, stainless steel surface still holding the tools arranged from earlier. But the feeling didn't leave. That crawling, prickling awareness that something else was in the room with me, not moving, not breathing, just watching. I shook it off and unzipped the bag halfway. Leonard Hartman looked like any other body, pale, stiff, cleaned by the coroner. But something about his expression made me pause. Most dead faces are empty, peaceful, collapsed into stillness. His wasn't. His jaw was tight. His lips parted as if trying to form a final word. And his eyes, though closed, held a tension underneath the lids, the faintest trace of a furrow in the brow. People always ask if bodies ever look like they're alive. Hartman didn't look alive. He looked like he died mid-thought. I noted the condition of the body, checked for personal effects, then prepared to transfer him to the loading stretcher. When I slid my hands under his shoulders to shift him, a sound cracked through the room. A soft, wet exhale. Not air escaping. Not fluid settling. This sound was controlled. Intentional. Slow enough that it felt like someone releasing a breath right beside my ear. My heart slammed against my ribs. I dropped his shoulder and took a step back so fast I nearly tripped over the stool behind me. Again, the silence returned, thick and heavy. My rational mind tried to catch up. Bodies release trapped air. It happens. You know this. You've heard it 100 times. Yes, I had. But never like that. Never so exact. Never when I hadn't even moved the chest cavity enough to force out any remaining air. I forced myself forward, placing my hands back under his shoulders. "Come on, man," I muttered under my breath. "Work with me tonight. Don't make this harder." I lifted. And that was when the table moved. Just an inch. Just enough for the metal legs to scrape across the tile with a long, dragging squeal. I dropped him again, stumbling backward. This time I didn't try to explain it. The table was locked. I had checked the wheels earlier. Tables don't move when they're locked, not unless someone pushes them. But I was alone. I stayed still for several seconds, listening for anything, breathing, footsteps, the click of the door. Nothing. The only sound was the low electrical hum of the emergency light above the sink. I needed a moment to regroup, so I walked to the furnace room. The hallway leading there felt longer than usual, the air shifting from cold to warm as I approached the massive chamber that housed the industrial cremation unit. The furnace door stood closed, heavy and motionless, a faint smell of burnt bone lingering from the last cremation at midnight. I checked the temperature gauge out of habit. The furnace was off. But the gauge read 660 degrees Fahrenheit. Impossible. When a furnace is off, it cools. It doesn't heat itself. It doesn't climb to hundreds of degrees on its own. I tapped the glass, thinking maybe the needle was stuck, but the metal quivered slightly, alive, reactive, following some internal pulse. A shiver crawled down my spine. I returned to the prep room, determined to finish the transfer quickly. The moment I entered, I felt the cold settle over me again. Colder than before, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the few minutes I'd been gone. Hartman's body lay exactly where I had left it. But the sheet covering his torso had slipped off, exposing more of his chest. Something I hadn't touched. My throat tightened. I wanted to say out loud that it didn't matter, that sheets slip all the time. But speaking felt dangerous, like acknowledging something I couldn't take back. Instead, I stepped forward, took a deep breath, and gripped the metal railing of the table. "All right, Leonard," I whispered, the absurdity making my voice crack. "Let's get this over with." And for the first time that night, I thought I saw the slightest movement beneath his closed eyelids. Just a flicker. Just enough to make me wonder if the dead ever fully leave before we send them into the fire. I steadied my breath, slid my hands beneath Hartman's shoulders once more, and forced the table to stay still this time. The metal was colder than before, so cold it felt damp, like something had sucked the warmth out of the room entirely. "I've got you," I muttered, though I wasn't sure who I was reassuring, him or myself. The moment I pushed the stretcher toward the doorway, the fluorescent light above us flickered violently. It sputtered, brightened, dimmed, then steadied again as if it had taken a panicked breath. I stopped. The light had been perfectly fine earlier. And this room didn't flicker without reason. Electrical issues? Sure, the building was old. But this felt timed. Like something reacting to movement. Reacting to us. I exhaled, tightened my grip on the stretcher, and pushed again. The wheels squeaked softly on the tile floor. Halfway through the room, the stretcher jerked forward a few inches, as if someone had shoved it from behind. Jesus. I spun around. Nothing. Empty room. Quiet. Air still. But the pressure, the awareness had grown stronger. Like walking with your back turned to someone staring at you. Except I knew I was alone. I knew it. I forced myself to keep moving. I'd seen things shift before, air pockets, uneven floors, wheel bearings catching, but this wasn't any of that. I had controlled the stretcher. My hands hadn't slipped. The floor was level. But the table still moved, on its own. As I rolled him into the furnace room, the smell of old smoke mixed with cold metal hit me again. The chamber loomed large in front of us, the industrial beast that ate what remained of life. Usually I felt nothing standing before it. Tonight it felt like standing at the threshold of something ancient and hungry. The temperature gauge still read high despite the furnace being off. It had climbed to 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Impossible, I whispered. A furnace cools over hours. With the power off, it cannot gain heat. Something inside would have had to generate that temperature. But nothing was inside. Not yet. I pressed the test button on the control panel. The panel buzzed weakly, lights blinking sluggishly like a patient refusing to wake after surgery. It wasn't right. It wasn't responding like it normally did. I tried again. Buzz. Flicker. Silence. I tapped the glass. The temperature needle twitched downward by maybe 5 degrees, then jolted sharply to 980 degrees Fahrenheit. My heart thudded. Something wasn't malfunctioning. Something was interfering. Still, I did what the job demanded. The dead wait for no one. I returned to the stretcher and reached for Hartman's ankle tag to verify identity one more time. But the moment my fingers brushed it, a soft knocking echoed behind me. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the furnace door. I froze. That door was 4 inches thick, steel layered over insulated firebrick. Nothing should echo through it, especially not knocking, especially not with the furnace off. My mind raced for an explanation. Cooling metal, shifting brick, leftover heat. But those sounds ring, pop, or creak. They don't mimic human knuckles. I turned slowly toward the door. The small inspection window was dark. Nothing moved inside. Just metal, I whispered. Just metal. I wasn't sure I believed myself. I grabbed the handle of the stretcher and began positioning it with the loading conveyor. My hands shook enough that the stretcher wheels rattled softly, squeaking against the tile. I hated that sound. It made the room feel more alive than dead. And then, right as I aligned the stretcher, a sound came from the body. A sharp, distinct click. I looked down. Hartman's jaw had shifted open another half-inch. I stumbled backward, nearly crashing into the control panel. My breath caught. Jaws don't open like that on their own, not without someone moving them or gravity forcing them downward. His head was positioned flat. There was no angle for natural movement. But his mouth had opened. More. Like he wanted to speak. I stared, waiting for movement. Anything. But his face remained still, frozen mid-expression. It's just physics, I said to myself quietly. Bodies settle. Muscles release. That's all. But the words tasted like lies. I steeled myself, slid the stretcher fully onto the conveyor, and prepared to guide him into the chamber. That was when the temperature gauge slammed to 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. The sound was like metal snapping under pressure. The needle hit the top of the scale so hard it vibrated. The panel lights blinked out. Then on. Then off again in a stuttering rhythm. Don't do this tonight, I whispered, pressing the reboot buttons. Not tonight. The machine didn't answer. But the body did. A sudden sharp thud struck the inside of the stretcher. right beneath the ribcage. The metal bounced under my hands. A muffled impact, like a fist slamming from inside. I yanked my hands away. My voice cracked. No. No, no, that's not. I looked around wildly for someone, anyone, who could tell me I wasn't losing my mind. But I was alone. Entirely alone. The thud came again. Then again. I backed away until my shoulders hit the wall. My breath quickened, my eyes wide and stinging. I'd experienced strange things before. I'd heard stories from older workers, glimpses in the corner of the eye, voices they swear came from vents, shadows lingering in rooms long after bodies were removed. But this was different. This was physical. This was force. I approached the stretcher again slowly, gripping the railing with both hands. My legs trembled so violently I had to lock my knees to stay upright. "Leonard," I whispered without thinking. "Please, not like this." The knocking stopped. Complete, suffocating silence filled the room. The furnace panel's emergency light blinked faintly in the corner like a dying heartbeat. I reached for the button that opened the furnace door. My hand hovered over it. Then, something caught my eye. Through the small, soot-streaked viewing window on the furnace door, a shape appeared. A silhouette. A long, tall, human-shaped shadow stood motionless behind the glass, inside the chamber that wasn't yet active. My vision blurred. My breath left my lungs in a painful rush. "No," I whispered. "That's not possible." But the shadow didn't vanish. It didn't waver. It stood perfectly still, shoulders slightly hunched, head angled, watching me. Or watching Hartman. I stumbled backward until my spine hit the cold metal of the panel. The room shrank around me. My throat tightened. The furnace was empty. I had checked it earlier. There was no body inside. No equipment left behind. No reason for a shadow to appear. Yet it was there. Unmoving. Waiting. I didn't dare breathe. My lungs burned. Then, the shadow tilted its head. Slow. Purposeful. Exactly the way a living person would examine someone they recognized. I let out a broken sound, half gasp, half sob. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow dissolved into the darkness. Swallowed whole by the chamber's interior. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced myself to swallow the terror clawing up my throat. "It's the lighting," I whispered shakily. "Just a reflection. Just something reflecting." But that wasn't true. I knew every angle of that room. Every source of light. Every surface capable of casting a shadow. There was nothing that could create what I'd seen. Still shaking, I turned back to the body. I had to finish the job. That was the only thing grounding me. Routine. Procedure. If I just followed the steps, everything would be okay. At least that's what I told myself. I pressed the button to begin the loading process. The conveyor belt hummed to life, but the sound was wrong. It vibrated harshly, like a machine straining under a weight far heavier than the 160-pound body resting on it. "Come on," I whispered. "Just work." The belt jerked forward. The stretcher rolled slowly, inching toward the open furnace. But before the body entered, every light in the room went out. Darkness swallowed everything. Complete, absolute black. My chest tightened as panic surged through me. I groped blindly for the emergency light switch mounted near the door. My fingers brushed cold metal. Then, a whisper slid through the darkness. Oh, gravelly. From the direction of the furnace. "Wait." The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't echo. It wasn't any sound a machine could make. It was a man's voice. A man who shouldn't be breathing. A man who shouldn't be speaking. I froze in place, every nerve screaming. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive, suffocating, pressing in like a hand around my throat. I forced my trembling fingers to find the switch. Click. Dim, red emergency lighting flickered on, painting the room in strange, bloody hues. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls. The stretcher had stopped moving. Hartman's head had turned slightly toward me. His jaw hung open wider than before. And his eyes were open. Red emergency lighting washed the room in a color that made everything feel wrong, too raw, too exposed, too alive. Hartman's eyes stared directly at me, milky yet focused, as if something behind them had just awakened. My knees nearly buckled. The stretcher creaked under his weight, settling into the conveyor belt that had frozen mid-movement. The furnace loomed behind him, its open mouth glowing with a heat it shouldn't have had. I didn't know whether to run, scream, or grab something heavy and swing. But I knew one thing for certain. Dead eyes don't follow movement. Yet as I shifted 1 inch backward, Hartman's gaze tracked me, slow, heavy, purposeful. No, you're not. My voice cracked, useless against the terror climbing up my spine. For a moment, the only sound in the room was my heartbeat hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. The air had grown thick, so thick I felt as if I were breathing steam. Every breath burned. Then the furnace answered. A deep, guttural humph echoed from inside the chamber, like breath being sucked violently out of a giant lung. Flames erupted along the base, swirling up the inner walls in violent colors, blues, purples, blacks. Nothing like the natural orange a cremation should produce. The fire danced, writhed, took shape. It almost looked like a silhouette. I stumbled back, slamming into the metal counter. Instruments rattled in their trays. One scalpel rolled toward the edge and clattered onto the floor. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the furnace. The flames twisted. Something inside moved. Not random heat flow. Not combustion. This movement had intention. Hartman's jaw snapped shut with a loud, wet clack. His eyelids fluttered. A sound vibrated in his throat, low, vibrating like a cable under tension. A sound that no dead man should have left. I shook my head violently. This isn't happening. This is a breakdown, a hallucination. I'm sleep deprived. But the fire exploded upward, slamming against the chamber walls with such force the entire furnace shook. The metal moaned under the pressure. Sparks shot out of the seams. The temperature gauge, still somehow operating, leapt from 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, then 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, then 1,780 degrees Fahrenheit, the needle quivering at the very end of the scale like it was about to snap off. The furnace roared. 3 loud knocks hammered the inside of the chamber door. Cock, cock, cock. The exact same rhythm as before, but louder, angrier. I jolted so hard my hand smacked against the counter. Pain lanced up my wrist. I didn't care. My panic drowned everything else out. This wasn't a building settling. This wasn't machinery. This was something trying to get out. The emergency lights flickered again, then steadied just long enough for me to see Hartman's chest rise. His rib cage expanded in a slow, shaky breath. I choked. Oh God, no, this can't be. Then he exhaled. The sound was jagged, wet, strained. Not human. Not living. But a breath nonetheless. I staggered back until my spine hit the furnace's side panel, heat radiating through the metal and into my bones. The room spun. My stomach twisted into knots. I forced myself to tear my gaze away from him long enough to hit the emergency stop on the conveyor belt. I had to shut it down, close the door, contain, whatever this was. But the moment my hand slammed the red button, the conveyor lurched forward. Not slow. Not steady. It surged, like something under the table had grabbed the wheels and yanked. No, stop. I grabbed the edge of the stretcher, digging my heels into the floor, pulling with all my strength. My muscles screamed. The belt jerked harder, dragging the stretcher, and me with it toward the furnace. Hartman's head turned again, but this time not toward me. Toward the fire. His mouth opened in a silent, stretched grimace, as if something inside the furnace was calling him. Or claiming him. The silhouette of flame inside the chamber twisted again, and for a brief, horrifying second I saw a shape, arms, shoulders, a head, press against the inner wall of the furnace like a person trying to push through molten energy. A hollow scream vibrated the metal. Not human. Not earthly. Something deeper. My grip slipped. The stretcher rolled farther in. Desperate, I lunged, reaching for the wheeled legs and gripping the cold metal with both hands. My fingers burned as friction tore skin from them. Blood smeared onto the railing. Stop. I screamed, voice cracking. Let him go. Let. A blast of heat shot from the furnace, and I cried out as it scorched across my face and arms. The temperature soared. The air shimmered. I couldn't hold on anymore. The stretcher ripped from my grasp. The metal wheels rolled up the conveyor and slammed against the furnace threshold. The entire frame shuddered. Hartman's lifeless body jolted. The stretcher began sliding in. But then, the furnace door slammed shut. Art. The metal crashed loud enough to rattle the entire chamber. I stumbled back, gasping, clutching my burning hands to my chest. Inside, fire roared, wild, alive, starving. The screams, whatever they were, did not stop. I stared at the sealed door, mind blank with terror, breath coming in ragged, broken gasps. I forced myself to move toward the control panel, thinking I had to stop the process, had to shut everything down before the furnace exploded. But the panel screen flickered violently, switching between static temperature readings and, impossibly, camera feed. The feed from inside the chamber. My stomach dropped to the floor. The camera showed the stretcher halfway inside the furnace, flames swirling around it, consuming nothing, burning without touching. And standing behind the stretcher was the shadow. The same tall, warped silhouette I'd seen earlier. But now, moved. It bent over Hartman's body, leaned close to his ear, and something in the flames shifted like it whispered. Then its head snapped, violently, toward the camera. Toward me. My breath froze. The screen crackled. The shadow stretched forward like it was pushing against the lens. And then the feed cut out. I stumbled backward, nearly collapsing. No part of my rational mind could explain what I'd just seen. Not fire. Not malfunction. Not hallucination. Something had looked at me from inside a sealed furnace. The control panel lights surged to life again, blinking bright red. Critical temperature. Override failure. Door locked. The furnace was running itself. I staggered back toward the center of the room, gripping the arm of a stool to stay upright. Sweat drenched my hairline. Panic clawed its way up my throat. Then, a voice whispered. Not from the furnace. Not from the chamber. From directly behind me. Don't, close. I froze. My blood turned to ice. Slowly, so slowly I turned. Nothing was there. But Hartman's body was lying on the floor, outside the furnace, on the cold tile, 2 feet behind me. The stretcher was empty. My heart crashed against my ribs. My legs nearly gave way. No, this isn't real, this isn't real. His head lay turned toward me, eyes open, mouth stretched wide in that impossible, grotesque imitation of life. His limbs were twisted in angles no human could achieve without breaking bones. My breath stuttered in my lungs. Then his fingers twitched and curled, like he was reaching for my ankle. I screamed, raw, primal, stumbled backward and slammed into the door. My shaking hand fumbled for the handle, gripping it so tightly the metal bit into my skin. NRIGHTBFOREIFLUNG Hartman's body jerked upright on the floor. Not slowly. Not naturally. As if yanked up by invisible strings. His head rolled limply on his neck. His eyes stared straight at me, empty, glassy, unblinking. And then, with a hollow crack, he tried to stand. The furnace behind him roared, the shadow writhing behind the sealed door, pounding to get out. This was no haunting. This was no echo. This was something claiming him, and trying to claim me too. Hartman jerked forward as if invisible hooks were pulling him toward me. His legs dragged across the tile, stiff and unnatural, knees knocking against the floor with each forced movement. The sound echoed through the room, sharp, dry, bone on stone. I yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, slamming my shoulder into the opposite wall. My breath tore in and out of my lungs, ragged and uneven. Every instinct screamed run, but my legs refused to cooperate. They felt like sandbags, heavy and unresponsive. Behind me the furnace wailed. A deep, metallic howl shuddered through the walls, vibrating through my teeth. It wasn't the sound of machinery. It was too mournful, too human. I forced myself upright, gripping the door frame. The emergency lights flickered in the hall, casting long, warping shadows across the floor. For a moment I thought one of them moved on its own. Then, A file fluttered out of the prep room, sliding across the tile and landing at my feet. Hartman's file. The man who shouldn't have been able to move. The man who shouldn't have been able to breathe. The man whose body was now standing upright in a room filled with fire and shadows. My trembling fingers reached down and lifted the folder. Inside, the first thing I saw wasn't the autopsy report. It was a photograph. A group photo. 4 men in the crematorium's break room, smiling, arms around each other, uniforms crisp and clean. And standing second from the left was Hartman. Younger, alive, leaner, eyes bright. And beside him, my supervisor Carl. The man who trained me 15 years ago. The man who was supposed to be on shift tonight, but called out sick for the first time in 5 years. My heart hammered painfully. I turned the photo over. On the back someone had written, Night Crew, 2014. Last shift together. But the date printed in the corner wasn't from 2014. It was from 2015. A full year after Hartman was reported dead in a car crash. My eyes snapped to the autopsy paperwork. The edges were yellowed, stained. The ink on the signature lines looked smudged, not from age but from being signed in a rush. 2 signatures. One name, Dr. Morris Levain. 2 completely different handwriting styles. One signature was jagged and shaky. The other was too neat, too controlled. A forgery. I flipped to the final page. The accident site photo wasn't a crash scene. It was a dark alley. A dumpster in the background. A smear of blood on concrete. The date didn't match the report. The location didn't match the report. And the body. The body in the photo wasn't even him. This wasn't a man who died. This was a man who was hidden. A chill clawed through my spine. What happened to you? I whispered. A sharp knock answered. 3 knocks. Cock, cock, cock. From the end of the hallway. I whipped my head up. The lights at the far end flickered violently. For a moment I thought I saw a silhouette, a tall, narrow shape, standing in the stuttering glow. Then it vanished. I backed into the prep room doorway, clutching the file to my chest. My entire body trembled. The furnace behind me roared, vibrating the metal floor. I forced myself to look inside. Hartman wasn't on the floor anymore. The stretcher where he had once been was overturned. The instruments on the counter had been knocked down, some scattered across the room. The emergency lighting pulsed like a heartbeat. And the furnace door, the one that had slammed shut, now stood open. Heat poured out in waves, scorching the air, making the edges of my vision shimmer. The silhouette of flame writhed inside, forming and dissolving, stretching and collapsing. Every now and then, it looked like a hand pressed against the inner wall. Not Hartman's. Something else's. Something older. Something furious. My gaze snapped to the security monitor mounted high in the corner, the one connected to the building's internal cameras. The screen glitched, crackled, then steadied enough to show a grainy feed of Carl, my supervisor, standing in the hallway outside the records room. Except, something was wrong. His shirt was splattered with something dark. His face pale. His eyes hollow. He stood completely still, hands at his sides, staring down the hall at nothing. No, not nothing. At someone. At me. The camera feed flickered. In the split second before it cut out, Carl stepped closer, much closer, to the lens. His mouth opened slightly and I could swear he whispered. I tried to warn him. The screen went black. I stumbled backward, heart slamming against my chest. Warn who? Warn Hartman? Warn me? The furnace wailed again, a long, agonized sound that shook the floor beneath my feet. Flames shot out the chamber mouth, curling around the edges of the door like grasping fingers. Something inside was fighting. Something inside wanted out. And then, through the roaring fire, through the smoke and distortion and heat, I saw a face. Not Hartman's. Carl's. Burned. Twisted. Mouth open in a silent scream. He pressed his face against the inner wall of the furnace, as if the fire itself were using him as a puppet. My stomach dropped, icy and hollow. Carl didn't call out sick. Carl was already dead. And Hartman had not returned. He had been returned to us. Forced. Dragged back. pulled into something he never escaped. The fire surged and Carl's face vanished into the flames. My hands shook violently as I flipped through the file again. On the very last page, scribbled in the margins, barely legible. Don't cremate him. They want him back. I can't hold them off anymore. C. Jensen, night shift. Carl. He wrote this. He knew. He tried to stop it. He failed. A gust of searing heat slammed against me and I dropped the folder. Papers scattered across the floor. The furnace door clanged against its hinges, metal buckling from the pressure inside. And that was when the realization hit me with bone-crushing clarity. This wasn't a haunting. This wasn't a spirit. This was a debt. And tonight, the dead had come to collect. The furnace door bowed outward as if something inside was throwing its weight against it. Metal screamed under the strain. Heat rippled through the room in violent pulses, scorching my skin and blurring my vision. I backed toward the hallway, my legs trembling, my breath breaking in shallow gasps. The papers from Hartman's file lay scattered across the floor like a warning that had come too late. A final roar ripped through the chamber, and the furnace lights surged white-hot, so bright it drowned out every other color, swallowing the room in blinding fire. Then just as suddenly, silence. The furnace door shuddered, then hissed, and eased shut. Not slammed. Not forced. Almost gently. The temperature gauge needle dropped in one smooth motion, settling back to zero as if nothing had happened. My ears rang. Sweat rolled down my face. Every muscle in my body trembled uncontrollably. I edged into the furnace room again, expecting to see Hartman's charred remains, or the shadow, or Carl's twisted face pressed against the window. But the chamber was empty. Completely empty. The stretcher was gone. The tools, the overturned table, all back in their proper places. Even the emergency lights glowed steady and warm, erasing the blood-red panic of moments before. It was as if the room had reset itself. Like it wanted to erase the evidence. Like it wanted me to doubt my own memories. My throat tightened painfully. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare into the quiet mouth of the furnace, the same furnace I had trusted for 18 years, and wonder if I had ever truly understood what lived behind its steel walls. Because something lived there. Something waited. I ran. I don't remember how I reached the exit. I barely remember unlocking my car with shaking hands or driving into the cold, empty streets before dawn. All I remember is the feeling, like eyes watching me from every dark corner of the building, following me all the way out. I didn't return the next night, or the next week. When the manager asked why I refused night shifts, I just said, "The furnace is acting up." He laughed. Said machines don't scare anyone. I didn't bother correcting him. Because machines don't whisper. Machines don't knock 3 times. Machines don't return bodies that should be ashes. It's been 11 months since that night. And I've never done another 3 a.m. cremation. But every year, on the same night, at the same time, 3:11 a.m., the furnace in room 4 turns itself on. Just for a moment. Just long enough for the temperature gauge to spike. Just long enough for the staff to hear a soft, unmistakable knocking echo through the hallway. Cock, cock, cock. They all ask what causes it. I don't answer. Because I know the truth. Some debts don't burn. Some souls don't leave. And some nights, if you listen closely, the dead still knock back.